The sheriff who cuffed the director. Sheriff Wade Colton wanted the window booth, and Ethan Marsh, a quiet widower halfway through his breakfast, refused to give it up. Colton called it obstruction, dragged him out of the seat, and cuffed him in front of 40 customers, grinning like he'd just brought down a dangerous criminal. Nobody in Millhaven Falls said a word. What Colton didn't know was that the man in his handcuffs had been sworn in as director of the FBI 11 days earlier, and had driven into town specifically to investigate him. Then 3 black SUVs pulled up outside. The rental crossed into Millhaven Falls a few minutes before 7 that morning, a gray sedan with a dented bumper and a paper mat still in the footwell. The driver wore a canvas jacket, worn jeans, and boots that had clearly been resoled at least once. No badge. No sidearm. Nothing to identify him beyond a driver's license that would pass any check a small-town clerk might think to run. His name was Ethan Marsh, and 11 days before, he'd been sworn in as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody back in Washington had liked the plan. His deputy director had argued that a man in his position didn't drive himself into towns like this, that field offices existed for exactly this reason, and the optics alone were a liability. Ethan had listened to the whole argument in a conference room with the blinds drawn, then said that reports written by people who'd never been mistreated tended to read very calmly. They compromised on 2 conditions: he'd check in every hour on the hour without fail, and a 2-agent protective team would station itself at the nearest resident office 31 miles up the state road. Near enough to reach him, far enough that nobody in Millhaven Falls would spot federal plates parked overnight. Ethan agreed to the arrangement the way a man agrees to something he never expects to actually need. At exactly 7, he pulled over at the town limit sign and made his first call. 9 seconds location, a confirmation he was fine, and done. He was 38. He'd been a widower for 4 years, long enough that the word had stopped feeling like an announcement and had simply become a fact about him, like his height or his hometown. It had also made him quiet in a useful way. He no longer rushed to fill silence. He let it sit, because he'd learned that most people, given enough of it, will eventually tell you exactly who they are. Millhaven Falls had earned its spot on his list the ordinary way. Not 1 or 2 complaints, which any department collects, but a slow, steady accumulation stretching back almost 20 years. Arrests that never became charges. Charges that vanished before arraignment. Property taken during traffic stops that never showed up on any inventory. 4 separate letters from 4 separate residents, describing 4 separate incidents in language so alike that the analyst who'd flagged the file had scrawled a single word in the margin: pattern. Every one of those complaints led back to the same name. Sheriff Wade Colton had run the department for 19 years. Before that, he'd worn a deputy's badge under a sheriff who'd once coached his high school football team. He was 61, broad through the shoulders, and had never lost an election, mostly because no one had ever bothered to run against him. In Millhaven Falls, that passed for an accomplishment. The town itself had the particular prettiness of places on the edge of losing something: a brick main street, a hardware store that survived on propane sales, a bank with its original 1930s lettering still carved into the stone above the entrance. Ethan drove its length twice, slow, like a stranger scouting for breakfast, and counted patrol vehicles, 3, across 8 blocks, in a town of roughly 4,000 people. He parked outside a diner with a hand-lettered sign offering biscuits and gravy for $6.50. By 7:15 the lot was already 2/3 full, mostly trucks, mostly older men. Through the glass he could see a counter lined with stools, a row of booths along the window, and a waitress moving between them with a coffee pot held low against her hip, topping off cups nobody had asked her to refill. He tucked his phone into his jacket pocket, got out, and walked into a building where no one had any reason to look at him twice. The bell over the door announced him. A few heads turned, registered a stranger, and went back to their plates. The waitress looked up from the register, and Ethan caught her name off the tag on her apron: Della Kirkwood, mid-40s, moving with the practiced ease of someone who'd worked the same floor for a very long time. She told him to sit wherever he liked, and he took the second booth along the window, facing the door, a habit so old he no longer noticed himself doing it. The vinyl seat had been patched with tape that almost matched. Through the glass, across the street, sat a low tan building with a county seal on it, which he'd already clocked as the sheriff's department. Della brought coffee before he asked for it. He ordered eggs over medium, bacon, wheat toast, and told her he wasn't in any hurry. She wrote it down without glancing at the pad, and something in the way she repeated it back told him she'd already decided he was just passing through, which was exactly the impression he wanted to leave. The room settled back into itself. Two men in feed store caps argued about a road resurfacing bid. A woman at the counter worked a crossword in pen. Somewhere in the kitchen a radio played a station that didn't quite come in clean. By every measure it was an ordinary morning in an ordinary town, and Ethan ate through the first half of his breakfast believing he might spend 3 quiet days here and leave with nothing but notes. At 7:40 the bell rang again, and the room changed. Nothing dramatic, conversation didn't stop, just dropped by a quarter, the way music drops when someone walks past a stereo, and several people suddenly found their plates very interesting. Ethan kept his eyes on his coffee and used the window glass, which gave him a clean reflection of the entrance. Sheriff Wade Colton came in first, hat in hand, 2 deputies behind him. The older one, thick-necked, at ease, went straight to the counter and poured himself a mug without asking. His name tape read Hutton. The younger one hung back near the door, hands at his belt, eyes mostly on the floor. His read Delgado. Ethan put him at 26 and noted that his was the only body camera of the 3 actually switched on. Colton worked the room on his way in, a hand on a shoulder here, a first name there, a question about someone's mother, and he waited for the answer. It was practiced, and it was genuinely warm, and Ethan understood immediately why 19 years of complaints had never once turned into an indictment. The man wasn't feared. He was liked. That was the harder problem. Then Colton reached the middle of the room and stopped, because a stranger was sitting in his booth. Della saw it first. Ethan watched her hand tighten on the coffee pot, watched her take half a step toward his table and then not take the second one. She turned instead toward the kitchen pass-through and stood there with her back to the room, and that told him more about Millhaven Falls than the entire complaint file had. Hutton set his mug down. Delgado lifted his head. Colton crossed to the booth without hurrying and stopped at the edge of the table, close enough that his belt buckle sat at Ethan's eye level. He looked down, almost friendly. "Morning," the sheriff said. "You're new." Ethan said good morning and agreed that he was. Colton nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd already suspected, and tapped 2 fingers on the tabletop, unhurried. Then he said this particular booth was his, had been every morning for years. That anyone in the room could confirm it, and that he'd appreciate it if the gentleman moved to the counter. The room went fully quiet. A fork touched a plate somewhere and it sounded enormous. Ethan looked up and didn't move. He said, evenly, that he'd come in at 7:15, been seated by the waitress, already been served, and intended to finish his meal right where he was sitting. No heat in it, no emphasis, like a man reading off a schedule. Colton's expression didn't shift, but his weight did. He said he wasn't sure the gentleman understood how things worked in Millhaven Falls. Ethan said he understood how restaurants worked, that the booth hadn't been reserved, no sign said otherwise, and every customer who walked through that door had the same claim on it. He added that if the sheriff wanted the seat tomorrow, he was welcome to get there earlier. Behind the counter, Della closed her eyes. Hutton laughed once, short and disbelieving, then stopped when nobody joined him. Colton went very still. In 19 years in that room, in front of these people, no one had ever told him no out loud. It had simply never needed testing. Watching him carefully, Ethan understood the sheriff wasn't angry yet, he was doing the math on what it would cost him to be refused in public, and not liking the number. "Stand up," Colton said. "On what grounds?" Ethan asked, politely. That was the sentence that ended it, not the refusal, the question. Colton turned to the room first, which was the tell, a man enforcing real law doesn't check his audience. He announced, loud enough for the parking lot, that the gentleman had been asked twice to comply with a lawful order and refused both times, and that he had no idea what a man like this was doing in his town, sitting where he could watch the department's front door. He said the word obstruction. Then he said it again, and by the second time he'd already made it true in his own mind. Ethan set his fork down flat and put both hands on the table where everyone could see them. He didn't stand, but he didn't resist either. Clearly, so the whole room heard it. He said he wasn't refusing to identify himself, his wallet was in his right jacket pocket, and he wasn't armed. Every person in that diner would remember that sentence almost word for word, later. Colton told him to stand up and turn around. He stood. He turned. He put his hands behind his back before being told to. A small, involuntary giveaway, 10,000 reps from the other side of it, his body faster than his judgment. The steel closed on his left wrist, then his right, and Colton ratcheted them one notch tighter than necessary, the way a man does when he's making a point instead of securing a prisoner. Nobody in the diner moved. 40 people, and not one of them said a word. That was the part Ethan would keep with him, not the cuffs. The silence. Facing his own reflection in the window, he catalogued the room behind him, the two men in feed store caps studying their coffee, the woman at the counter with her pen frozen mid-crossword, Della at the register with both hands flat on it and her jaw set. Every one of them knew this was wrong. Every one of them ran the same arithmetic and landed in the same place. Then Colton started talking. To no one in particular, which meant he was talking to everyone. A man had been sitting where he could watch the department's front door for 35 minutes. A man who refuses a lawful order in public is telling you something about himself. He'd been doing this 19 years, and the day he stopped paying attention to strangers was the day this town got hurt. Nobody contradicted him. That was the whole of it. Ethan stood with his shoulders against cold metal outside and counted. 14 adults within earshot who'd watched the entire thing unfold from the moment the sheriff crossed the diner floor. The two men in feed store caps now out at the window with their coffee, one with a phone in his jacket pocket. The woman with the crossword. Della, who'd come as far as the doorway and stopped there with a towel in her hand, the only person in Millhaven Falls looking directly at him. None of them said a word. He wasn't angry with them, which surprised him a little. He'd expected to be. But a stranger costs you nothing, and Wade Colton costs you everything for as long as you intend to keep living here. 19 years is long enough to teach a whole town to run that calculation without noticing it's running. Delgado came out of the diner behind the sheriff and stopped by the front fender of the lead cruiser. He hadn't touched Ethan once. He was young enough that the uniform still looked slightly borrowed, and he kept glancing at the man in cuffs and then away, the small light on his chest camera burning steady the whole time. Hutton noticed it too, told him he was running his battery down over a table dispute. Delgado said flatly that the camera stayed on during a custody transport, a rule he'd clearly memorized, because it was the only thing he had to stand on. Colton turned at that, looked at him for a moment, not unkindly, the way a man looks at a new hire who's spoken out of turn in front of a customer, and said that when he had 19 years in, he could decide what needed recording. He said it warmly. A few people in the lot laughed. The light stayed on. Delgado didn't switch it off, and he didn't look at his sheriff again either. Ethan filed that away with everything else. At 8 o'clock sharp, the phone in his jacket started ringing. Muffled against his ribs, 6 rings, then silence. Hutton heard it and grinned, said the man's ride was calling. Colton didn't react at all. He was busy telling a story about a case out on the county road 3 summers back, and the phone was just background noise on a morning that was going well for him. It rang again 40 seconds later. Then a third time. Nobody reached into his pocket. Nobody searched him. Nobody asked whose phone it was. Ethan stood absolutely still against the patrol car and let it ring, and for the first time since the cuffs closed, something in his face changed, not fear. Something much worse for Wade Colton, patience. 31 miles up the state road, the 2-agent protective detail watched 3 calls roll to voicemail, checked a location ping that hadn't moved from a diner parking lot in 11 minutes, and stopped waiting. They were rolling within 90 seconds. The field office in the state capitol had a second team behind them 9 minutes later. By 8:20, the words director and no contact had climbed far enough up the chain that a deputy director in Washington was standing at his desk with a phone in each hand. Colton finished his story, opened the rear door of the cruiser, put a hand flat on the roof, and told Ethan to watch his head. They arrived from the west end of Main Street at 8:35. 3 vehicles moving fast in formation, the sound reaching the lot before the sight did. Black SUVs, identical, plates that weren't state plates. The lead vehicle came in at an angle that sealed the lot. The second stopped nose out on the street. The third pulled across the driveway and idled there. Doors opened all at once. 9 people climbed out, everyone with a badge on a chain and a windbreaker lettered across the back in yellow. The lot went silent inside a single breath. Men set their coffee down on truck hoods without seeming to notice they were doing it. Hutton's hand drifted to his belt and stopped halfway. Delgado stepped back and put his hands out from his sides, palms open, the single most professionally correct thing anyone in a Millhaven Falls uniform did all morning. A woman rounded the front of the lead SUV with her credentials already raised, somewhere near 50, dark suit under the windbreaker. She didn't look at the crowd, the vehicles, or the diner. She swept the lot once, the way people are trained to. "Special Agent Renata Ford," she said. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'm looking for Director Ethan Marsh." Wade Colton then did the thing that would follow him for the rest of his life. He smiled. He stepped forward, pleased to be useful, pleased to be the man in charge of his own ground fielding a question from federal officers. He pointed with his whole arm at the man in handcuffs against the rear door of his patrol car. "That's your boy right there," Colton said. "Picked him up about 45 minutes ago in the diner. Obstruction. If he's part of your business, he's all yours, but I'll tell you right now, he was sitting in there watching my building since 7:15. Nobody moved." Ford looked at the man in handcuffs. Something crossed her face and was gone. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped into a register that carried further than shouting would have. "Director. Are you injured?" Ethan said he wasn't. Behind her, a second agent stepped forward with his credentials open, heavyset, gray at the temples, name of Curtis Blake, and he didn't address the sheriff at all. He addressed the lot. "This is Ethan Marsh," Blake said, holding the credentials up and turning slowly so the diner windows, the men by the trucks, and every deputy present could see the photo and the seal. "Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Sworn in 11 days ago. He's here on federal authority. As of this moment, this is a federal scene." What went through the lot wasn't a gasp. It was smaller and worse. 40 people understanding the same thing in the same second, and none of them willing to be first to say it out loud. Della's hand came up over her mouth and stayed there. Colton didn't move, his arm still half raised from pointing. The color drained out of his face top down, and then he laughed once, short and ugly and unconvinced, and said that wasn't possible. Ford told him it was. Colton said the man had no identification. Ethan spoke then, for the first time since the diner door had closed behind him, and didn't raise his voice. "I told you where my wallet was," he said. "In front of this whole town. You didn't look." The sheriff's mouth opened and nothing came out. Hutton had gone the color of paper, staring at his own hand, the one that had been on the prisoner's arm, the way a man looks at something he's just realized he can't put back down. Delgado's camera light was still on. It had caught every second of it, from the moment the sheriff crossed the diner floor to the sentence Blake had just spoken, and every person standing in that lot would spend a long time being grateful a stubborn young deputy had refused to switch it off. Ford held out her hand and told Colton to produce the key. He did, his fingers not quite working right, dropping it once, picking it up off the asphalt in dead silence. Then Ethan said something nobody expected. "Not yet." Ford stopped, key in hand. Ethan said evilly that the cuff stayed on until the scene was documented, photographs from every angle, the position of every vehicle recorded, the name of every person present written down while they were still there, and all of it done with the restraints exactly where Sheriff Colton had put them. He said a man in this town had been arrested that morning for finishing his breakfast, and the only difference between him and the 4 people who'd written letters to Washington was that this one had 3 vehicles on the way. The record was going to show exactly what it looked like. So it stayed on for 11 minutes. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation stood in a diner parking lot in handcuffs while agents photographed him and the whole town watched, and Wade Colton stood 6 feet away and was made to watch longest of all. Blake worked the lot with a notebook. Ford worked the phone. The third vehicle never left the driveway. Then it all came apart fast. Two agents crossed the street to the tan building and served paper on the desk clerk before she'd finished standing up. The security camera above the door, the one with the red light that had been pointed at the road all morning, came off its bracket within the hour and went into an evidence bag. So did the camera over the diner's register, with Della's written consent, given so quickly she signed the form standing up against the pie case. At 9:15, from a terminal inside his own department, Colton filed a supplemental narrative describing a subject who'd turned physically combative in the diner and repeatedly refused to identify himself. 40 people had just watched that not happen. He filed it while 9 federal agents stood in the parking lot outside his window. Server access was suspended at 9:40. Dispatch logs, arrest reports, evidence inventories, tow records, personnel files, 19 years of them, went under federal seal before noon, the supplemental narrative buried with the rest of it, timestamped and unamendable at 25 minutes old. Hutton was relieved of his body camera. It held 9 seconds of footage for the entire shift, which became a document all its own. Delgado handed his over before being asked, unclipped it himself, and read the serial number aloud before passing it across. Blake looked at the steady light on the front of it, then at the deputy, and wrote something down. One of the men in a feed store cap, a propane customer named Earl Whitcomb, waited until the lot had thinned, then came to Blake with his phone held out in both hands. 22 seconds of video, the sheriff crossing the floor, the word obstruction, twice. He said he'd pocketed it because Hutton had looked his way, and that he'd sat in his truck for an hour deciding whether to come over at all. Blake took the phone and told him he'd been the first person in that building to move. Then the thing nobody had planned began. People started crossing the street. First was Owen Castillo, 51, who ran the propane counter at the hardware store and had written one of the 4 letters. He walked up to Blake with his hands shaking and said he'd been arrested in 2019 over a taillight, held 19 hours, released with no charge, and had never gotten his tools back out of the truck bed. After Castillo came a woman pulled over 5 times in a single month. After her, a man who'd been told on a dark road with no camera running exactly what would happen to his liquor license if he kept talking to the county about his brother. By noon there were 9 of them in the lot. By 2, Ford had stopped taking statements outside and opened a room in the town hall because the line was visible from Main Street. 19 years of quiet arithmetic, and the whole town was suddenly doing the math out loud at once. The paperwork didn't need interpreting, which is the particular tragedy of men like Wade Colton. They believe the danger lives in what people say. It almost always lives in what they wrote down. 14 arrest reports carry timestamps altered after filing, 6 of them by more than 4 hours. 2 evidence inventories listed one cash figure at intake and a different figure in the disposition column. 11 arrests across 7 years had no charging document at all, including one man held 41 hours, and in every one of those cases no prosecutor had ever been told an arrest occurred. County Prosecutor Denise Okafor had her own problem. Her office had declined to act on 9 excessive force complaints against the department over 6 years, 7 of them without ever opening a file. Colton made his calls from the sidewalk, phone against his ear, hat in his other hand, the lot watching him do it. He called Mayor Silas Bowe, who listened 90 seconds, said he'd need to consult the council, and hung up. He called Okafor, who told him she was recusing herself and that he shouldn't call her again. He stood there with the phone still in his hand afterward and didn't dial a third number, because there wasn't one. By early afternoon there were 2 news vans at the west end of Main Street, with a third on the way. The Bureau's press office released a 4-sentence statement and answered nothing further. Ethan Marsh declined comment on the record and would keep declining for 17 days. At 3:15, in front of the department he'd run for 19 years, County Commission Chairman Grant Ashworth served Wade Colton with an emergency suspension order issued that morning out of the State Attorney General's office. Ashworth's hands weren't steady either. He read it aloud, because the order required it be read aloud. Colton surrendered his service weapon and his commission card, unpinned his own badge, and set it on the hood of his patrol car. It made a very small sound against the metal. Then Blake told him he was the subject of a federal civil rights investigation, conducted jointly with the Department of Justice, and read him his rights out loud on the sidewalk, with the men from the pickup truck still there to hear it. 19 years, undone in a single day, and the strangest part was that none of it had ever been hidden. It had been sitting in that tan building the whole time, waiting for a morning when he picked the wrong man. The town didn't celebrate. That was the part nobody in Washington would understand later, reading the summary. No applause on Main Street when the badge went into the evidence bag. No crowd. By 4, the lot outside the diner had emptied. The trucks were gone, and Millhaven Falls had gone very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, because Colton wasn't the only person exposed that morning. 40 people had watched a man get handcuffed for finishing his breakfast, and 40 people had decided, in the same second, it wasn't worth the cost. They'd gone back to their coffee. They'd watched from the windows, cups in hand. Now they were sitting in their kitchens with a different answer in front of them, but the thing they'd been calling common sense for 19 years had another name. Della closed the diner at 2 that afternoon, 4 hours early, flipped the sign, and sat in the second booth with the lights off for a long time. She told Ethan about it later in a statement, and that was how he learned it. Castillo went back to the propane counter and didn't sell a thing the rest of the day. 3 separate people came in asking what he'd told the federal agent in the lot. He told them. All 3 went and joined the line at the town hall. The room they gave Ethan in that building had a folding table, 2 chairs, and a window looking out on the back of the bank. He worked out of it until nearly 9 that night, and at some point Renata Ford came in, set a paper cup of coffee in front of him, and finally said the thing that had been sitting in her since 8:35 that morning. He could have ended it in 4 seconds. She'd watched the register footage twice. There were at least 3 moments where one sentence from him would have stopped the whole thing before the cuffs came out. She wanted to know why he hadn't said it. Ethan turned the cup a half turn on the table and didn't touch it. He said that when he took the job, 4 letters from this county had crossed his desk in the same week, describing the same experience in nearly identical language. He'd read them in a conference room where everyone agreed the situation was serious, and nobody present had ever been on the other end of it. I wanted to know what it actually feels like, he said. To be a person a room decides isn't worth the trouble. Not to read about it. Not to have it briefed to me. To be the man against the car, with no name to say out loud, no badge, and nobody coming. Ford pointed out that by 8:35 he'd had 3 vehicles coming. They didn't, Ethan said. Owen Castillo didn't. That's the entire point. He sat 19 hours in that same building over a taillight, and nobody in this town came for him either. The only difference between him and me this morning is that my phone was already ringing. If he'd identified himself in the diner, he said, the department would have produced a clean report by noon and a sincere apology by dinner, and every one of those 19 years would have stayed exactly where they were. The arrest was the only evidence nobody could argue with, and he'd let it happen because he was the first person in Millhaven Falls in 2 decades who could actually afford to. Ford sat with that a while, then asked if he intended to speak to Colton. He said he did, in front of the man's lawyer, on his way out of the building, with nothing in his hands and nothing to ask him. He was a witness in this case and a victim in it, and he wasn't going to hand any defense attorney in the country a reason to throw the whole thing out. It happened 2 days later, on the front steps of the Tan building, at 4 in the afternoon. Colton came out with an attorney a half step behind him, in a windbreaker and an untucked shirt, and without the uniform he looked like exactly what he was, a heavyset 61-year-old man who'd run out of phone numbers. He stopped when he saw who was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Ethan told the attorney plainly he was asking no questions, that his own agents were 10 feet away, and that his client was free to end this at any word. The attorney looked between them and said nothing, which was permission enough. Colton spoke first. He said he'd kept this town safe for 19 years. No homicide in Millhaven Falls since 2011. He'd pulled a family out of a flooded car on the county road with his bare hands. Half the people in that line at the town hall had called him at home on a Sunday at least once. He said it all flatly, like a man reading his own resume to a wall. Ethan told him every word of it was true, that it was in the file, and that it would go to the prosecutors along with everything else. Then Colton said the thing he'd clearly spent 2 days building toward. That none of this would have happened if a stranger hadn't sat in his booth. That if the man had just moved to the counter, none of it, and he didn't finish the sentence, because he heard it himself. No, Ethan said. People always believe the collapse started the day someone finally caught them, and it never does. 14 reports had been altered before he'd ever crossed the county line. 11 people had been held with no charging document across 7 years. Owen Castillo's tools had gone out of a truck bed in 2019 and never appeared on any inventory in that building. None of that had anything to do with the booth, Ethan said. You didn't fall this morning because you arrested the director of the FBI. You'd have fallen the same way if I'd been nobody. You'd just have fallen slower, and it would have cost more people on the way down. You stopped being able to tell the difference between the law and your own pride. And once a man can't tell those apart, the badge is only a delay. Colton looked at the railing under his hand and said, very quietly, that he'd never thought of himself as a corrupt man. Ethan said he believed that, and that it was exactly why the file ran 19 years long. Ethan flew back to Washington on the third day, because the director of the bureau can't run a field investigation and shouldn't try. Ford stayed. The case was formally consolidated within the week. The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division took it on jointly with the Bureau, which is the only way a case like this gets built, and the charges came down in the second week: deprivation of rights under color of law, across multiple counts, falsification of records, conspiracy, involving 2 other members of the department. Roy Hutton was named on 3 counts. He resigned by letter the day before he was served, which changed neither the indictment nor his exposure to it. Denise Okafor's office was placed under separate review for the declined complaints, and she stopped taking calls from anyone in Millhaven Falls. Mayor Silas Bowe didn't resign. He stood up at the following Tuesday's town council meeting, in a hall packed with 312 people and folding chairs down the side aisles, and said he'd eaten breakfast 2 booths from that window for 6 years and never once asked a question, and he wasn't going to stand there now and pretend to be surprised. It wasn't much of a speech. It was the first honest one that Room had heard in a long time, and it let him finish it. The county named an acting sheriff 9 days after the arrest, Miles Delgado, for years on the department, the only person in a Millhaven Falls uniform that morning with a camera actually running. That footage became the spine of the whole case: the sheriff crossing the diner floor, the refusal, the word obstruction twice, the cuffs, 11 minutes in a parking lot where 40 people said nothing at all. Delgado didn't want the job. He said so on the record, told the council he'd stood in that lot, taken 1 step forward, then gone and gotten the door instead, and that a man who'd done that shouldn't be handed a department. Grant Ashworth, sitting in on the appointment, said the only thing he said all evening: across 19 years of Wade Colton running that building, Miles Delgado was the only person in it who'd ever left a light on. The reforms were neither dramatic nor fast. Body cameras switched to continuous recording on every contact, uploading to a county server nobody inside the department could reach. Arrest reports locked at filing, with amendments visible as amendments. Every custodial hold went to the prosecutor within 6 hours or the person walked. An outside review board was seated with 5 residents on it, Owen Castillo among them, which nobody in the room found funny, and everyone found fitting. None of it was new. All of it had existed on paper somewhere in that building already. It had simply never been enforced by anyone who could be told no. What actually changed in Millhaven Falls was smaller, and harder to write into policy. People started talking. The line at the town hall ran 9 days. By the end there were 61 statements on record, 44 of them describing incidents more than 3 years old. Meaning that for 3 years, the people of that town had each been carrying the same story, and every one of them had believed he was the only one holding it. A woman described 5 traffic stops in a single month. A man described a conversation on a dark road about a liquor license. 2 of the 4 original letter writers came in and asked whether their letters had ever even been read, and were told they were the reason any of it had happened at all. Della Kirkwood gave a statement that ran 9 pages. Most of it was about mornings. Ethan came back to Millhaven Falls on a Thursday, 17 days after the morning he'd first arrived. He pulled up to the diner at 7:15, same hour, same rental sedan with the dented bumper, same canvas jacket. He hadn't bothered with a suit. Ford had suggested one, he'd said no, and she'd understood why before he finished saying it. The news vans were gone from the west end of Main Street. Had been for 11 days, which was about as long as anything holds. The lot was 2/3 full. The bell rang. The room stopped. It wasn't the same stopping as the first morning. That time, a stranger had walked in and nobody had looked twice. This time, every head in the building came up at once, and for a moment nothing happened at all. Then Earl Whitcomb, in his feed store cap at the counter, the man who'd held a phone under a table's edge for 22 seconds before pocketing it, set both palms flat and stood up. The woman with the crosswords stood next. Then the two men in the corner booth. Then the rest, in ones and twos, until nobody in the diner was still sitting. Not one of them said his title. Nobody said director. They stood the way people stand when they can't think of anything to say, and standing was the only thing left that meant anything. Ethan understood exactly what it was, for not the office he held, but 11 minutes in a parking lot. He nodded to the room once and went and sat in the second booth along the window. Della brought the coffee before he asked, same as the first time, and her hand wasn't steady. She didn't take out her pad. Eggs over medium, bacon, wheat toast, she said, and asked if that was still right. He said it was. She stayed at the edge of the table, pot in hand, and told him she'd been standing 4 feet from that booth holding this same pot and hadn't put it down, and that she thought about it every morning now. He told her she'd signed a consent form standing up against the pie case before the agents had even finished asking, that the register footage was in the case file, and that she'd done more that day than anyone else in the building. She went back to the kitchen and didn't come out for a while. He ate the whole breakfast this time. Through the window he could see the tan building across the street, the camera on its bracket replaced with a newer one, an acting sheriff who hadn't wanted the job working a desk inside. At 7:50, Miles Delgado came out the front door, saw the sedan in the lot, and looked across at the window. Ethan raised 2 fingers off the tabletop. Delgado nodded and went to his vehicle.